Hello, my name is Joe Bates and welcome back to the Appraisal Toolbox for today's presentation, calculating the lender's yield. The lender's yield problem deals with the lender's internal rate of return, another way to say yield rate, and it's affected by three things: the points that are charged to the borrower by the lender, the origination fee that is charged to the borrower, and whether or not there's a balloon payment or an early payoff of the mortgage amount. Before we get into the mortgage yield problem, let's take a quick look at a property yield scenario because they're a lot more straightforward because they are not complicated by the points and the origination fee, etc. So here on the screen, we have a worksheet that shows a fairly simple series of cash flows. If a property was acquired, there's a negative cash flow at time zero because what? That is the purchase price. We're looking at this investment from the buyer's perspective. And then we have a series of cash flows, and those are annual cash flows or net operating income. And then finally, we have the reversion of the property that occurs at the end of the investment period. Now, we can solve these problems with Google Sheets and HP 12C. Today, we're using Excel, and I've taken the worksheet cash flows and converted them with just a few keystrokes to a very simple graph timeline here that shows the cash flows. And when you look at these cash flows, you'll notice that the initial cash flow or the cash out by the investor is a negative, and it's below zero, right? Because that's money spent by the investor to acquire or purchase the property. And then the investor receives positive cash flows, in this case, 10 of them, which represent net operating income. And then finally, at the end of the investment period, the lender also receives the reversion, which stacks up on top of the 10th payment or the 10th year cash flow because the reversion occurs at the end of the 10th year, same time that we receive year 10 NOI. So now that we know the cash flows, we can turn to our internal rate of return calculation, which measures or compares what the investor paid for the property or the cash out to all of the positive or periodic cash flows that occur during the investment period, including the reversion. And once the present value of all the cash flows are calculated and compared to the cash out or the purchase price, we can then develop the internal rate of return. So on the screen now, we have a chart that has the cash flows for the mortgage yield problem, which is very similar to the cash flows for the property yield. Why? Well, there's a negative cash flow in the beginning, and this is from the lender's perspective because the lender is the investor. And then there are a series of 5 cash flows, or what? Mortgage payments, annual debt service, followed by the green reversion bar that occurs at the end of the 5th year, and that's what? The balloon payment. Now, if we were to take an example of a mortgage here and put it on a timeline, it would look something like this. And in this case, we have a $500,000 mortgage that is amortized over a period of 25 years at 8% interest. So we have a timeline that shows the entire amortization period, or the 25 years. Now, this particular loan also has a balloon payment due at the end of 5 years, or an early payoff of the mortgage, and that's indicated on the timeline by the green marker. And you can see that once the balloon payment is made, there are no other subsequent payments. The loan is paid off in full, so there's no more payments after year 5 due to the lender. The final step in the calculations of a lender yield problem is dealing with the fees, the origination fee, the points paid, and to determine how that impacts the actual proceeds to the borrower. So in this case, we have $15,000 of origination fee and we have 2 points. So let's see how that affects the cash flow to the borrower. The face value of the mortgage is $500,000. So if we deduct out the expense for the 2 points or 2% of the mortgage amount, that's $10,000 due to the lender. And the borrower also has to pay a $15,000 origination fee. So after payment of those 2 expenses to the lender, the borrower actually is only going to receive $475,000. So the face value of the mortgage is $500,000, but the borrower walks out of the bank with $475,000. Another way to look at these problems is with a timeline that shows the 3 stages of what's happening in the investment. And we start with the 25-year period or the amortization period because that is key and that is necessary in order to determine what the annual debt service is for the loan and what the amount of the balloon payment is. But then if we continue to the investment period as it's reduced by the balloon period, really what we have is a 5-year investment period for the lender, or a series of cash flows that only occur for 5 years. And then finally, we need to deal with those points and origination fees that are paid on the date of the mortgage. So it's a step-by-step process, and it's 3 steps because there are 3 different timelines, if you will, or time periods that are in play for these problems. On the screen now are the keystrokes for the HP12C, and if you were to enter the keystrokes for the mortgage information, for the balloon payment, and for the fees and points that are paid, you can solve for the internal rate of return, which in this case, for this example, is 9.3%. So you can see that even though the lender was charging the borrower an 8% interest rate for the mortgage, after the fees were paid, which include what? The origination fee and the points, and after the early payoff of the mortgage, the 5-year balloon period payment was made, the return or the yield that the lender actually received was 9.3% on this investment. Okay, so if you go to our website, you will find worksheets and in Excel, as well as the full version of the HP12C keystrokes that you can download. And we've got all kinds of practice problems dealing with mortgage yield problems and internal rate of return for properties and for mortgages on our website in the practice problems section. So feel free to help yourself to those resources. We thank you again for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and we look forward to seeing you again.